August 17, 1943. Dawn breaks reluctantly over the airfields of eastern England, but the anticipated sunrise brings no clarity. Instead, a thick blanket of fog drapes itself across every base of the 8th Air Force, reducing visibility to nearly zero. On these scattered airfields, more than 300 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses sit ready, their aluminum skins beaded with moisture, 4 massive Wright engines cold and waiting. Inside briefing rooms across East Anglia, hundreds of young American airmen have already learned their targets for the day. They know where they're going. They know what awaits them there. What they don't yet know is that they're about to fly into one of the most controversial and costly missions of the entire strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. The targets themselves tell you everything about American ambitions in the summer of 1943. Schweinfurt, a Bavarian town whose very name would soon inspire dread in bomber crews, housed 5 factories producing nearly 2/3 of Germany's ball bearings. Those seemingly insignificant steel spheres were the lifeblood of German war production, essential components in everything from tank treads to aircraft engines, from submarine machinery to artillery systems. 400 miles into the heart of the Third Reich, Schweinfurt represented what American planners called a bottleneck target, a single point whose destruction could theoretically cripple the entire German war machine. Regensburg, meanwhile, hosted sprawling Messerschmitt factories that built roughly 1/3 of Germany's fighter aircraft, including the formidable Bf-109 that had been ravaging bomber formations for months. By August 1943, the combined bomber offensive had reached a critical juncture. The strategic concept was elegant in theory. British bombers would burn German cities by night through area bombing, while American B-17s and B-24s would strike precision targets by day, systematically dismantling the Nazi war economy piece by piece. This round-the-clock bombing campaign was supposed to force Germany to its knees without requiring the massive casualties of a ground invasion. The point-blank directive, issued just months earlier, had made the destruction of German fighter production a top priority in preparation for the planned invasion of France. But reality had proven far more brutal than theory. German fighters were becoming more aggressive, their tactics more refined, and American losses were mounting to unsustainable levels. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress seemed purpose-built for this kind of mission, at least on paper. With 4 powerful radial engines producing 1,200 horsepower each, the Flying Fortress could carry 6,000 pounds of bombs deep into German territory at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet. But it was the defensive armament that gave the aircraft its name and its reputation. 13 Browning 50 caliber machine guns bristled from positions throughout the aircraft, from the twin guns in the tail turret to the single weapon poking from the radio operator's position. American doctrine insisted that bombers flying in tight formation could create overlapping fields of fire so devastating that German fighters would be shot from the sky before they could press home their attacks. Each carried a crew of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, who also served as top turret gunner, radio operator, ball turret gunner suspended beneath the aircraft in a tiny transparent sphere, 2 waist gunners, and a tail gunner. These were young men, most barely out of their teens, who would spend hours in unpressurized aircraft at temperatures plunging to 50 degrees below zero, breathing oxygen through masks, wearing bulky electrically heated flight suits that often malfunctioned. Colonel Curtis LeMay commanded the 3rd Bombardment Division, and on this particular mission, he would personally lead the attack on Regensburg. LeMay had earned his reputation through relentless training and innovative tactics. He'd been one of the first to recognize that when bombers took evasive action over their targets, they missed what they were aiming at, requiring repeat missions that resulted in even higher losses. So he ordered his pilots to fly straight and level through the flak, maintaining formation discipline no matter what. His crews hated the order at first, but the numbers proved him right. LeMay also pioneered the combat box formation, a 3-dimensional arrangement of aircraft that maximized defensive firepower while minimizing vulnerability. Now he was about to test another innovation, the first American shuttle mission. His force of 146 B-17s would strike Regensburg, Then instead of turning back into the teeth of German defenses, they would continue south over the Alps and land at bases in North Africa. It was brilliant in concept, but it required perfect timing and created an 11-hour mission that pushed the B-17's operational limits to the breaking point. Brigadier General Robert Williams would command the force striking Schweinfurt, 230 flying fortresses from the 1st Bombardment Division. The operational plan called for Williams' force to take off 30 minutes after LeMay's aircraft, maintaining just enough separation to split German fighter defenses. The Luftwaffe would have to choose which formation to engage most heavily, and with any luck, neither American force would face the full fury of German defenses. Diversionary missions by medium bombers and fighters would further complicate German response, drawing attention away from the main bomber streams. It was an ambitious plan, perhaps too ambitious, and it demanded one thing above all else: precise timing. German defenses in August 1943 represented a formidable obstacle, one that American planners had not yet fully appreciated. The Luftwaffe had pulled fighter units back from the Eastern Front, concentrating roughly 400 fighters at 24 bases throughout Germany and occupied territory. These weren't the undermanned, undertrained units of 1942. By mid-1943, German pilots had refined their tactics specifically for attacking B-17 formations. They discovered that head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high gave them the best chance of breaking up formations before defensive fire could track them. Twin-engine heavy fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and Junkers Ju-88 had been retrofitted with heavier armament, including rocket pods that could be fired from outside the range of defensive machine guns. Some carried 37 cannons that could blow a B-17 apart with a handful of well-placed rounds. And the single-engine fighters, primarily the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109, had learned to attack in coordinated waves, overwhelming defensive gunners with simultaneous attacks from multiple angles. The flak was equally deadly. German 88 anti-aircraft guns surrounded every major industrial target, firing proximity-fused shells that detonated in black bursts at precise altitudes, filling the sky with shrapnel that could shred aluminum skin and sever control cables. The distinctive black puffs of exploding shells marked the path of every bomber formation, each burst representing potential death. And unlike fighter attacks that came and went, the flak was constant and inescapable over the target, forcing crews to fly straight and level through a steel hurricane while bombardiers lined up their aim points. American fighter escorts in August 1943 could only provide partial protection. The workhorse P-47 Thunderbolt had the performance to challenge German fighters, but its combat radius extended barely to the German border. British Spitfires had even less range. This meant that for most of their mission, the bomber formations would be entirely on their own, dependent solely on their defensive armament and tight formation discipline. The previous months had demonstrated with brutal clarity what happened when formations encountered determined German fighter attacks without escort. Loss rates had climbed steadily from 2% to 10% and higher on some missions. Replacement crews arrived in England with increasingly brief life expectancies. The strategic bombing campaign hung in the balance, and the brass knew it. At dawn on August 17, the fog refused to lift. On coastal bases around Norfolk, where LeMay's 3rd Division was stationed, the weather was marginally better, but in the Midlands, where Williams' 1st Division waited, visibility remained near zero. Mission commanders faced an agonizing decision. LeMay's force had to depart by 8 a.m. at the latest if they were going to reach North Africa before dark. The 11-hour mission left no margin for delay. But launching into dense fog invited mid-air collisions during formation assembly, when dozens of bombers would be climbing through the same airspace trying to find their assigned positions. Hundreds of tons of high explosives and thousands of gallons of aviation fuel suspended in barely controlled chaos. One mistake, one moment of disorientation, an aircraft would collide, killing 20 men in a fireball before they ever saw an enemy fighter. LeMay had anticipated this problem. He drilled his crews relentlessly on instrument takeoffs and blind formation assembly, procedures most bomber pilots found nerve-wracking at best and suicidal at worst. Now that training was about to pay off. At 6:21 a.m., 90 minutes behind the original schedule, the first B-17 of LeMay's force roared down the runway and disappeared into the grey murk, climbing blind on instruments alone. At 50-second intervals, bomber after bomber followed, threading their way into the overcast. It was a testament to LeMay's training regimen that not a single aircraft was lost to collision during this terrifying procedure. Gradually, impossibly, 146 flying fortresses assembled themselves into combat formation over East Anglia, circling a radio beacon while fuel gauges steadily unwound. Meanwhile, at the inland bases of the 1st Division, William's force remained grounded. The fog showed no signs of clearing. Every minute of delay meant that the carefully planned 30-minute separation was growing. The entire operational concept depended on both forces entering German airspace almost simultaneously, forcing the Luftwaffe to split its defenses. As the delay stretched from minutes to hours, that advantage was evaporating. German radar operators would track the first formation, giving fighter controllers ample time to engage, return to base, refuel, rearm, and launch again to intercept the second wave. But LeMay couldn't wait any longer. His fuel state demanded immediate departure if his force was going to make North Africa. At approximately 10 a.m., with the Schweinfurt force still grounded, LeMay's 146 bombers turned southeast and headed for the enemy coast. The Regensburg force crossed the English coast at Lowestoft, then struck out across the North Sea toward Holland. For the first portion of the mission, they had fighter escort, P-47 Thunderbolts from 3 fighter groups and RAF Spitfires, but everyone knew the fighters could only stay for a limited time. As the bomber stream approached the Dutch coast around 10 a.m., German radar installations had already tracked their approach. Luftwaffe fighter controllers scrambled every available aircraft, and observers on the ground watched the first German fighters climbing to intercept altitude, positioning themselves in the sun where bomber gunners couldn't see them until it was too late. The P-47s engaged immediately, diving into formations of Focke-Wulf FW-190s that were assembling for coordinated attacks. Gun camera footage would later show brief, violent encounters as American and German fighters tangled at 25,000 feet. But there were too few American fighters and too many German ones, and the escorts had to break off and turn for home before their fuel ran out. The Spitfires departed first, barely making it past Antwerp before their fuel state forced them back. The P-47s stayed longer, but by the time the bomber formations crossed into German airspace, they too had to abandon their charges. Bomber crews watched their escorts wag their wings in farewell, then peel off and dive for home. Now the flying fortresses were truly alone, with more than 400 miles to go before reaching their target. German fighters had been studying the bomber formations, identifying the groups flying the loosest formations, the aircraft that seemed damaged or were struggling to keep up. Now they struck with practiced precision. The classic attack came from 12 o'clock high, fighters diving out of the sun in groups of 4 or more, passing through the bomber formations at combined closure speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Defensive gunners had perhaps 2 seconds to track, aim, and fire before the fighters flashed past. The combined firepower of massed 50 caliber machine guns created visible streams of tracer fire, but hitting a target moving that fast at that range required equal measures of skill and luck. Some German fighters approached more cautiously from the rear, flying parallel to the bomber stream just outside effective range, then turning in to attack the trailing squadrons where defensive fire was less concentrated. Twin-engine heavy fighters stood even farther out, launching unguided rockets that tumbled through the bomber formation's trailing smoke. While these rockets rarely scored direct hits, they forced formations to break, creating gaps that single-engine fighters exploited ruthlessly. Individual stories of courage emerged from the chaos. One, known as Ex-Virgin, took a 20 cannon shell through the fuselage that killed a waist gunner instantly. With oxygen systems damaged and 4 crewmen bailing out to save oxygen for those remaining, the crippled bomber somehow kept flying. When the bomb release mechanism jammed, a wounded gunner climbed into the freezing bomb bay, loosened the shackles with a screwdriver, then physically kicked the bombs free before collapsing from blood loss. Another aircraft, My Prayer caught fire over Germany. The entire crew except the pilot, co-pilot, and top turret gunner belayed out. The gunner's parachute had been destroyed by fire, trapping him aboard. Despite a leg full of shrapnel, he extinguished the flames, then took over the nose guns and helped fight off continued attacks all the way back to England, flying most of the return leg at treetop height. The German attacks continued without respite all the way to Regensburg. 17 bombers fell from the formation during the running battle, leaving smoke trails marking their final moments. Parachutes blossomed as crews abandoned doomed aircraft, though some parachutes never opened, and some aircraft exploded so violently that no one escaped. The survivors pressed on, maintaining formation discipline even as they flew through the debris fields of their fallen comrades. Approaching Regensburg, the weather finally offered one mercy: clear skies. Bombardiers could actually see their targets, a rarity in the European theater where cloud cover obscured targets more than half the time. The Messerschmitt factory sprawled below, vast assembly halls and machine shops clearly visible. As the bombers reached their initial point and turned onto their bomb runs, German fighter attacks abruptly ceased. Luftwaffe pilots knew better than to fly through their own flak, which now filled the sky with black bursts of exploding shells. For 6 agonizing minutes, the B-17s flew straight and level, while bombardiers made final adjustments and flak burst all around them. Then bomb bay doors opened, and 300 tons of high explosives and incendiaries tumbled down. LeMay would later claim the factory was totally destroyed, and reconnaissance photos confirmed extensive damage to assembly halls, and crucially, the jigs used to build the new Me-262 jet fighter, setting that program back by months. But the mission was barely half complete. Rather than turning back through the gauntlet of German fighters, LeMay's formation turned south toward the Alps. A few twin-engine fighters made half-hearted attacks, but most of the Luftwaffe force was already landing to refuel and rearm for the second wave they knew was coming. 2 damaged B-17s limped into neutral Switzerland and were interned. LeMay circled his formation over Switzerland for 20 minutes, allowing damaged aircraft to catch up, then struck out across the Mediterranean. 5 more bombers ditched in the sea as their fuel ran out. Others crash-landed in Italy. Of the 146 aircraft that had departed England, only 122 made it to the primitive airfields in Tunisia, and more than 60 of those had battle damage. The landing in North Africa revealed just how brutal the mission had been. Ground crews discovered aircraft with hundreds of holes, severed control cables, dead engines, hydraulic systems shot away. The men who climbed down from the aircraft were exhausted, many wounded, all traumatized by what they'd endured. LeMay had warned them that North Africa offered no luxury accommodations, and he was right. Many crews slept on the ground under their aircraft's wings. Repair facilities were virtually non-existent. Ground crews cannibalized parts from the most heavily damaged aircraft to get others airworthy. In the end, only about 80 aircraft could be pieced together for the return flight. Meanwhile, back over England, the fog had finally cleared enough for Williams' force to take off, but it was now past 1 p.m., more than 3 hours behind the original schedule. That 3-hour delay had completely undermined the operational plan. German radar tracked the Regensburg force all morning. Luftwaffe fighter controllers watched it head south and correctly concluded it wouldn't be returning the same way. Now they could focus their entire defensive effort on the second wave. Fighters that had engaged LeMay's formation landed, refueled, rearmed, and took off again. Additional units that had been held in reserve were committed. When Williams' 230 B-17s crossed the enemy coast, they faced not a divided defense, but the concentrated fury of more than 300 German fighters from 24 bases. The massacre began almost immediately. Even before the escort fighters had to turn back, German fighters were attacking in waves. Units from Jagdgeschwader 1, 11, 26, and others pressed home coordinated assaults. The attacks came from every angle: head-on passes from 12 o'clock high, diving attacks from above, beam attacks from the sides, rockets launched from outside defensive range. Some German pilots flew directly through the bomber formations, cannons blazing, accepting hits from defensive fire to guarantee their own shots connected. The bomber formations began to disintegrate under the sustained assault. Two bomb groups suffered catastrophic losses. The 91st Bomb Group launched 21 aircraft and lost 9, a 43% loss rate. The 381st Bomb Group launched 24 aircraft and lost 12, exactly 50%. Across the entire force, bombers fell from the sky trailing smoke and flame, some exploding in midair, others spiraling down with dead or wounded pilots slumped over the controls. The survivors tightened their formations and kept flying, knowing that breaking formation meant certain death. Defensive gunners fired until their barrels glowed red and ammunition ran out. Some kept firing even after being wounded, slumping over their guns as consciousness faded. The approach to Schweinfurt became a trail of smoke and burning wreckage. By the time the surviving aircraft reached their initial point, 28 bombers had already been destroyed. The remaining aircraft turned onto their bomb runs and flew into intense flak. The ball-bearing factories were among the most heavily defended targets in Germany. Albert Speer, the German armaments minister, had personally warned Hitler that Schweinfurt's destruction could cripple German war production within 4 months. Accordingly, the defenses were formidable, but the American bombardiers did their jobs, and bombs fell on 4 of the 5 main factories, causing extensive damage. Then came the nightmare return flight. German fighters renewed their attacks the moment the bombers left the target area, and this time they focused on aircraft already damaged. Bombers with engines out, with wounded pilots, with oxygen systems shot away, fell behind the formation and were systematically destroyed. The attacks continued for more than 2 hours, until finally, mercifully, Allied fighters appeared to provide withdrawal support. 93 P-47s and 95 Spitfires claimed 21 German fighters shot down, enough to drive off the attackers and allow the battered survivors to limp home. 8 more bombers were lost before reaching the relative safety of the North Sea. 3 more crashed while attempting to land. Others reached their bases but were so heavily damaged they would never fly again. Ground crews counted the returning aircraft and found 36 missing from the Schweinfurt force, adding to the 24 lost from the Regensburg mission. 60 B-17s destroyed in a single day, each carrying a crew of 10 men. 552 American airmen were listed as missing, with about half becoming prisoners of war and 20 interned in neutral Switzerland. The rest were dead. Another 7 crewmen died from wounds after reaching base, and 21 were seriously wounded. German losses stood at 25 to 27 fighters destroyed, despite American gunners' claims of nearly 300 kills. The disparity between claims and actual losses was standard in aerial combat, where multiple gunners might fire at the same aircraft and each claim credit for its destruction. What mattered was the loss ratio. America had lost 60 heavy bombers with their trained crews. Germany had lost about 24 fighters. At that exchange rate, the 8th Air Force would be extinct before the Luftwaffe suffered serious attrition. The strategic impact proved equally disappointing. German ball-bearing production dropped from 140 tons in July to 69 tons in August and 50 tons in September, exactly the kind of damage American planners had hoped for. But Albert Speer immediately implemented emergency measures, drawing on reserve stockpiles and dispersing production to other facilities. Within weeks, production had recovered. The raid against Regensburg damaged the Messerschmitt factory substantially, but again, German authorities responded by dispersing production and utilizing slave labor to accelerate repairs. The infrastructure damage proved far less permanent than hoped. Most critically, American planners failed to follow up with sustained attacks. Strategic bombing required persistence, hitting the same targets repeatedly until Germany couldn't recover. Instead, the 8th Air Force had to pause to rebuild its strength, absorbing replacement crews and aircraft. When they returned to Schweinfurt on October 14, the results were even worse. That mission, forever after known as Black Thursday, cost another 60 B-17s lost and 17 more damaged beyond repair, a loss rate exceeding 26% of the attacking force. After Black Thursday, deep penetration raids into Germany were suspended for 5 months. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission exposed the fundamental flaw in American strategic bombing doctrine. The theory that massed bombers could defend themselves proved catastrophically wrong when facing a determined, well-equipped opponent. The bomber crews had fought with incredible courage, maintaining formation discipline and pressing their attacks despite horrific losses, but courage alone couldn't overcome the stark mathematics of the air war. Without long-range fighter escorts, daylight precision bombing deep into Germany was simply unsustainable. The lessons took time to sink in, primarily because they were so costly to accept. The entire American strategic bombing campaign was predicated on the B-17's ability to fight its way to any target in Europe. Admitting that premise was false meant admitting that hundreds of men had died for a flawed concept. But the October raid forced a reckoning. Deep penetration missions were curtailed until long-range escort fighters became available. Development of the P-51 Mustang accelerated, and drop tanks were developed to extend fighter range. By early 1944, American fighters could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and the balance of the air war finally began to shift. The human cost of August 17, 1943, transcended statistics and strategic analyses. 552 families received telegrams informing them that their sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers were missing in action. Some would eventually learn their loved ones were prisoners, providing a sliver of hope amid the grief. Others would never know exactly how or where death had come. The crews who survived carried memories of watching friends die, of aircraft exploding in Medea, of wounded men bleeding out in freezing aircraft while still hours from help. Many would fly 25 missions and go home, but they would never truly leave the sky over Germany. For the Germans, the raid demonstrated that American strategic bombing posed an existential threat. The stress contributed to the suicide of Luftwaffe Chief of Staff Hans Jescheneck the day after the mission. Fighter production became the top priority, with resources diverted from other programs. Speer's dispersal of industry, while successful in the short term, created inefficiencies that would increasingly hamper German war production. The raids forced Germany into a defensive posture, dedicating fighters and flak guns to home defense rather than supporting ground forces on the eastern and Mediterranean fronts. August 17, 1943 marked a turning point, though not the one American planners had hoped for. The mission proved that strategic bombing could damage German industry, but it also proved that such missions came at a cost that couldn't be sustained. The path forward required acknowledging these hard truths and adapting accordingly. When American bombers finally returned to Schweinfurt in February 1944, they did so with long-range fighter escorts that fundamentally changed the nature of the air war. The escorts didn't just protect bombers, they actively hunted German fighters, forcing the Luftwaffe into battles of attrition it couldn't win. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission deserves remembrance not because it succeeded, but because it revealed the price of strategic misjudgment and the extraordinary courage of men who flew into hell because their commanders ordered it. Those young crews, barely out of their teens, climbed into aluminum tubes and flew straight and level through concentrated fire from hundreds of fighters and thousands of anti-aircraft guns. They did this not once, but repeatedly, knowing the odds meant they probably wouldn't survive their required 25 missions. Their sacrifice eventually contributed to Allied victory, but only after strategic doctrine evolved to match the reality they discovered at such terrible cost. If you found this deep dive into one of World War II's most brutal air battles compelling, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We are committed to telling the stories of courage, sacrifice, and hard lessons learned from history's greatest conflict. What other lesser-known battles from the air war should we explore? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, remember the price that was paid for the freedoms we enjoy today.